It's time for this.
Order, order. I call Matt Chorley and Tim Shipman.
So if you've not listened to us doing PMQs Unpacked like this before, what we do is instead of just playing it all out and leaving you to pick through and try and work out what is going on, Tim Shipman and I pause the action and explain and pick apart the exchanges between Boris Johnson and Keir Starmer. We'll also hear from Ian Blackford, the SNP Westminster leader, and then we'll come back after the 12:30 news with the best of the West and any other news lines that might appear. Tim, this time last week, we were excited about the prospect of PMQs. It was 24 hours after Keir Starmer had called for a circuit breaker lockdown. It didn't really live up to billing. Do you think it might be slightly spicier or enlightening this time around?
Yeah, I think there's quite a lot going on this week, and I think Starmer knows he didn't do a brilliant job of prosecuting his argument last week, and his troops will want to see him do better this week. And there's a lot of angst on the Tory benches. Last night Boris Johnson was offering Andy Burnham 60 million quid, but lots of people went away with the idea that he was only offering him 22 million, and that was because the PM didn't make the argument himself, didn't sell what he was doing effectively. So there's quite high stakes for both of these leaders. Starmer to land his arguments and land his blows, and Johnson to actually, state his case a bit more effectively.
And do you think this is all just down to sort of bad comms, if you like, or is there a genuine? Is it a policy issue or is it a comms issue?
Well, I mean, most comms people would tell you that there's only so much that you can polish certain items. And if the policy ain't right, the comms are not going to save it. But it's certainly been the case throughout this crisis that the two have gone fairly hand in hand. And I think most Tory MPs would say that neither of them has been as effective as they might be. And
of course, if the spike in coronavirus was happening in, traditional Tory rural areas, there wouldn't be quite the same political dimensions of this. But the fact that he's hitting precisely those areas that Boris Johnson made huge inroads in December, and that Keir Starmer needs to win back if he's got any hope of ever becoming Prime Minister.
And that's the clever thing that the Labour Party is doing this afternoon. They're trying to get those Tory MPs who won those red wall seats in a position where they either vote with the opposition or voters there will remember it in a few years' time at the next general election.
OK, let's get ready to go live to the House of Commons. Keir Starmer, the Labour leader.
If the infection rate R in a Tier 3 area has not come below 1, will it be possible in any circumstances for that area to come out of Tier 3 if the R hasn't come below 1?
Mr. Speaker, obviously the R is one of the measures that we look at, and we'll take a decision based on a number of things, including the R, but also, of course, rates of infection, rates of admission to hospital and other data. But the most important thing is for areas that do go into Tier 3, and I'm very grateful to local leadership in the areas that have gone into Tier 3, because it's the right thing for them to do, the right thing for their constituents, the right thing to save lives. When they are able to make progress, and of course they will come out of Tier 3. And as he knows full well, the measures that are put in place are reviewed every 28 days.
So we slightly lost Keir Starmer's first question there, but it sort of doesn't matter.
Because it seems like it was the same as his second question.
Not least because, we lost a bit of Boris Johnson's first answer, but it doesn't matter because we got it repeated again the second time round. This is an important question, though, isn't it? There's always this sort of sense of, everything's just getting worse again. So you go from Tier 1 to Tier 2 to Tier 3, even though we're not supposed to call it that. It's supposed to be medium, high and very high or whatever it might be.
Yes, turn it up to 11, as they used to say.
But
Spinal Tap.
There's no sort of criteria for getting out. Actually, if the government said, well, get your cases down to this level, there might be a bit of sort of, local effort to do that. Because if you do that, you can go to the pub again or whatever it might be.
Yeah, I mean, there's a grown-up response to that, which is that it's terribly complicated and there are lots of ways of measuring this. And it might be that you have infection rate, or it might be that you have other local problems, and they don't just want to set one metric and say that once you achieve that, you come out of it. But it is a political problem for the Conservative Party that hardly anyone who's gone into these higher tiers has ever gone to lower tiers or come out of them at all. You've got to hope that that's possible, but I mean, the more people you speak to in the government, the more you think that probably isn't going to be very likely until the spring.
Yes, well, let's go back to the House of Commons. Keir Starmer.
Stop.
Mr. Speaker, I'm now confused by the Prime Minister's answer. If it's not the R rate under 1, what is it? Because millions of people want to know the answer to that question, because millions of them are in Tier 3 and millions more are likely to go into Tier 3. They really need to know. And Prime Minister, on Friday, the Chief Scientific Officer said Tier 3 on its own certainly isn't enough to get the R rate below 1. On the same day, the Prime Minister himself said there was only a chance of getting infection rates down. This goes to the heart of the issue in Greater Manchester and elsewhere, because the widespread fear, Prime Minister, is that Tier 3 is the worst of all worlds. It brings significant economic harm without getting the virus sufficiently under control to exit Tier 3. So instead of being a solution, Tier 3 is a gateway to weeks and weeks, more likely months and months of agony, from which there's no likely exit. Can the Prime Minister not see the problem if there isn't a clear exit?
Sorry, Mr. Speaker, I've made it absolutely clear that a part of the country going into Tier 3 is only in there for 28 days. We will review it after 28 days, and areas that have gone into Tier 3, I believe, are already making progress, and areas where there are restrictions in place are also showing signs of progress. We are pursuing, Mr. Speaker, a local, a regional approach, which is the sensible approach for this country. That's what the epidemiology supports. It's what the Deputy Chief Medical Officer supported last night. And again, I want to thank local leadership in Merseyside, in Lancashire, actually in London and West Midlands and elsewhere for what they are doing. And I may say that it is a bit incoherent of the right honourable gentleman opposite to attack local lockdowns when he wants to plunge the whole country, back into a damaging lockdown for weeks on end, and he has no clue about how he would propose to get the country out of that, does he?
Well, there's quite a lot to unpack there. So, Keir Starmer now saying that Tier 3 is the worst of all worlds. You get the economic impact of places being shut down, but he's saying it's not enough to bring down the virus. Boris Johnson saying, well, actually, it's only lasted 28 days and we'll review it. Also citing, this is really interesting last night, Jonathan Van Tam, the Deputy Chief Medical Officer, last night endorsing the regional approach.
Yeah, and saying it's nonsense to have people locked down in East Anglia and Cornwall when they've hardly got any infection. So that is the part of the government's approach which seems to be just about holding politically. You can well envisage a situation in a couple of weeks' time when most of the country's in Tier 3, but bits of it will not be. And Keir Starmer, would be effectively arguing that those bits should be as well. So Boris Johnson rightly says, what would be your route out of this? But this isn't questions to the Leader of the Opposition, so I doubt we'll get an answer from Starmer. Interesting, though, that Johnson did seize on the Jonathan Van Tam comments because, that's what he needs to do politically, is take people backing him up where he can and wheel them out. The other thing that Van Tam has said recently is that we're getting much closer to a vaccine. And the government's real strategy, of course, is that they're buying time for a vaccine, but they're dressing it up as something else.
It's also worth remembering, it's nice to see JVT, Jonathan Van Tam, as JVT, as they all seem to call him at the press conference. He's now back in the fold. He's in the good books again.
Well, now that he's said something supportive.
He was very much in the bad books after he criticised Dominic Cummings for going to Barnard Castle and then wasn't seen again for weeks. He was locked in a cupboard somewhere. Let's go back to the comments.
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, I appreciate there's going to be a review every 28 days, but if the R rate hasn't come below 1, then the infection rate is still going up, and the numbers are going up, and the admissions are going up, and the numbers in hospital are going up, and the deaths are going up. Is the Prime Minister seriously saying that he would take a Tier 3 area out of Tier 3 with the R above 1? I don't think so. Let me spell out what this means. On Friday, thousands of people in Greater Manchester, taxi drivers, pub and hospitality workers, people working in betting shops, the self-employed and freelancers, will either be out of work or face significant pay cuts. That's the reality on Friday in Greater Manchester. But their rent and their mortgage won't be lower, their food and their heating bills won't be lower, and that could last for months. Why can't the Prime Minister and the Chancellor understand this? Stop bargaining with people's lives, stop dividing communities, and provide the support that's needed in Manchester.
I have to say I'm slightly confused about what exactly Keir Starmer's driving at here. He wants to know when we get out of Tier 3, and Boris Johnson already wants to make sure that we'll review it in 28 days, and if it's working, cases go down. And then he attacks the government for suggesting how it might bring an area out of Tier 3.
Well, I mean, we have a slight... there's a disconnect between Labour national policy and Labour regional policy here to a degree. You've got Labour mayors saying we will not be locked down. You've got Labour centrally saying everyone must be locked down. And some people will find that slightly discordant. It's just another, PMQs with Starmer building a sort of fairly moderate argument and not actually really swinging his weapons with all the verve that other leaders of the opposition might have done, I think.
Or even the way that other regional mayors may have done.
Well, quite. And, one of the things about Andy Burnham's performance over the last week, some of it's to do with Manchester. There's quite a lot of people in the Labour Party think it's to do with looking like a more effective leader of the opposition than Keir Starmer.
He did run for leader, of course, and he famously lost to Jeremy Corbyn. So we'll see. Yeah, I'm not quite sure how that pans out. But yeah, well, let's see if Keir Starmer manages to hit something home with this one.
Mr. Speaker, I'm very proud that this government has already given Greater Manchester £1.1 billion in support for business, £200 million in extra unring-fenced funding, £50 million to tackle infections in care homes, £20 million for tests and trace, another £22 million for local response that we announced yesterday. And yesterday, the Mayor of Greater Manchester was offered a further £60 million, which he turned down, Mr. Speaker, with no encouragement, I may say, to support from the right honourable gentleman. So I can tell the House today, Mr. Speaker, is that cash will be distributed to the boroughs of Greater Manchester. And I want to thank my honourable and right honourable colleagues across the House for Hayward and Middleton, from Bolton North West, from Bolton North East, from Bury South, Bury North, Cheadle, Lee, Altrincham and Sale West, and Hazel Grove for the support that they have given in this matter, Mr. Speaker.
Oh, that's literally how it ended. Boris Johnson just naming Tory MPs' constituencies.
Yes, and desperate to keep them in his tent. But actually, that was a proper effective riposte to some of the moaning about the money. Boris Johnson has a couple of problems here with these red wall seats and the North in general. He is constantly battling a political meme that he's incompetent or that he can't spin his own policies. The much more dangerous thing would be if people became convinced he was genuinely heartless and didn't care about the North. So he can keep spouting the money, and if it doesn't look like he's done it effectively, politically, all the time, that answer will, I think, go some way to reassuring Tory MPs that he does know how to make a simple political argument about money. Because what they can't have is the view getting hold that the Tories don't care about the North, just like Maggie Thatcher didn't.
Yeah, exactly right. And that's a big issue. It's just to point out, it does look like Boris Johnson had a haircut. If you're interested in such matters, he does look a bit smart. It looked a bit wild last week, and it looks a bit neater and tidier this week. Let's go back to question number 4 from Keir Starmer.
This is a Prime Minister that can pay £7,000 a day for consultants on track and trace, which isn't working, that can find £43 million for a garden bridge that was never built, but he can't find £5 million for the people of Greater Manchester. I really think the Prime Minister's crossed a Rubicon here, not just with the miserly way that he's treated Greater Manchester, but the grub it, take it or leave it way these local deals are being done. It's corrosive to public trust, to pit region against region, mayor against mayor, council against council, asking them to trade away their businesses and jobs. We need a one-nation approach. Replace these endless local battles with clear national criteria and proper support for jobs. Labour's motion this afternoon would do that. Why won't the Prime Minister support it?
Well, that was a bit punchy, and it sort of, ticked a lot of boxes. These Prime Ministers crossed the Rubicon. He could find £40-odd million. I mean, it's basically a Twitter argument. £40 million for a garden bridge which doesn't exist, but couldn't find £5 million for Greater Manchester.
Boris Johnson normally likes a sort of an ancient Roman analogy as well, so the Rubicon thing will be very exciting for him. But, saying that these grubby take-it-or-leave-it deals are corrosive to public trust, and a lot of Tory MPs would agree with that. They can't understand why Boris Johnson's getting into a political debate with Andy Burnham and arguing about how much money it should be, when they could just say, you have X number of people and these are your problems and there's a national criteria for it. This is how much money you get. Go away and spend it.
And £5 million is not even an accounting error in the terms of public finances.
No, 65 million quid these days is not even an accounting error.
And so part of me just thinks, find out what Andy Burnham wants and give him £5 million more and just sort of embarrass him into being grateful rather than giving him all these opportunities. I also think there's a slight flaw in Keir Starmer saying, let's abandon these region against region things and go for a national approach. I think you'll find if you did that, you'd suddenly find places like Cornwall would be far more vocal in this debate.
Not many Labour votes in Cornwall, though.
Well, I don't know. There's a couple of seats down there that they've had their eye on in the past, particularly with the demise of the Lib Dems. They used to have a couple of MPs in Cornwall, I think, but it's a long time since that happened. Anyway, let's go back to the Commons.
Mr. Speaker, I'm proud of the support that we've given, the One Nation Conservative support that we've given to the entire country. £200 billion in support for jobs and livelihoods across the whole of the country already. A further £9.9 billion now for the Jobs Support Scheme. It is this government that has cut VAT for business, deferred business rates. There is no other country in Europe, Mr. Speaker, where so much support, so much help has been given to the population to get through this crisis, and we will continue to do that. But I think it is the height of absurdity, Mr. Speaker, that he stands up and attacks the economic consequences of the measures that we're obliged to take across some parts of the country when he wants to turn the lights out with a full national lockdown, taking kids... That was his policy last week anyway, wasn't it? Perhaps he could confirm that's still his policy. Is that what he wants to do?
Here's Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, at his press conference yesterday, the Prime Minister produced heat maps across the country showing the infection rate up in all ages across all regions, and particularly showing regions that have been in the equivalent of Tier 2 restrictions for weeks, if not months, moving into Tier 3. Now, if they're moving into Tier 3, Tier 2 hasn't worked, because if Tier 2 worked, they should be going to Tier 1. So Tier 2 goes to Tier 3, Tier 3 has no end, because there's no prospect or confidence in the R rate coming below 1. And I do not believe that a Tier 3 region will come out of those restrictions unless R is below 1 and whilst numbers are still going up. So we now have a stark choice. And by the way, Prime Minister, Cornwall is the only place, possibly with the Isle of Wight, where the infection rate today is less than Greater Manchester when it went into local restrictions. So this idea that some areas are immune is wrong. So there's a stark choice. Carry on with the Prime Minister's approach, which will lead to weeks and weeks and months of prolonged agony in all your constituencies for millions of people in Tier 2 and 3 with no exit, or put in place a 2 to 3 week time-limited circuit break to break the cycle and bring the virus back under control. Wales, Northern Ireland and Scotland in part have chosen that path. With half-term starting this Friday, this may be the last opportunity for the Prime Minister to put in place an effective circuit break. The Prime Minister was too slow in the first phase of this pandemic. He's being too slow again. We cannot repeat this mistake. Will he act in the public interest and take the opportunity to put in place a circuit break this Friday?
Before we hear from Boris Johnson, I suspect the answer is going to be no, by the way, but before we hear from Boris Johnson's response to the call for a circuit break, I thought there was... Doing quite a lot of work in that was Scotland in part, given that actually what Scotland is doing is much more like Boris Johnson's approach, and parts of Scotland where there are high levels of cases have got tighter restrictions than other.
Exactly, and frankly, Wales and Northern Ireland, given how many people live there, are about probably the same significance as one of the main English regions. So, in a sense, it's all a regional approach.
Everything is a regional approach. Keir Starmer again attacking Boris Johnson. He was too slow in the first phase.
Yeah, and this has been their big argument since the spring that the government dithered in March and April, and it's dithering again. Boris Johnson's previous answer was all about one nationism and trying to sound like a national leader again.
One thing that Keir Starmer didn't bring up is there was a SAGE member, John Edmonds, about an hour ago was talking to MPs, and he said the most difficult thing to predict is government behaviour. Most of the time people's behaviour is governed by the government. At the moment it's difficult to say what government will do. Just nice because, again, we've talked about this before, the speed with which the Starmer team operate to latch on to things which happened in the morning. Sometimes, maybe you'll bring that up next week. Anyway, let's go back and hear what Boris Johnson said.
Mr. Speaker, we will do whatever it takes to get this country through the crisis, with or without the support of the right honourable gentleman opposite. And I may say that I think that his policy, I've explained why I don't believe that his policy is the right one for the country, because it would involve closing schools, it would involve shuttering businesses, with all the psychological, the emotional damage that lockdown of that kind brings. He can't say how many circuit breakers he thinks would be necessary. He can't say how long they would go on. He can't say how much damage they would do to the UK economy and to people's mental health, Mr. Speaker. We, on the other hand, want to go on with our commonsensical approach, which is a local and a regional approach, keeping kids in school, keeping our economy moving, because that is the way to get the whole of our country through this crisis together, so that we all, and particularly those regions that are now, alas, under Tier 3 restrictions, all the regions of the country bounce back strongly together, Mr. Speaker.
Let's head up to...
There we are. It's the commonsensical approach there from Boris Johnson making his case. It was really interesting earlier this week when we did our focus group with swing voters, specifically on the coronavirus thing. None of them had noticed Keir Starmer's intervention last week, and this has come up time and time again. He's not really having an impact on them. He's struggling a bit to sort of insert himself into this as a issue.
Yeah, and because he's sort of made this pitch as this kind of statesman-like figure who's going to argue about the detail, not all of that cuts through, to the main evening news. And I was interested in what you were just saying, that they're not seizing on stuff that's happening in the morning and making a big show of that, because that's one way you can get yourself into the daily headlines. If you make PMQs about stuff that's happening that day, it's much more likely to make it into the broadcast bulletins. What Starmer's team is very good at, they'll have a letter or an example of something outrageous, and he'll raise it at PMQs, and then all the journalists start getting that letter in their WhatsApp very quickly afterwards. It looks quite professional. But if Jeremy Corbyn had ignored all these things in the morning, lots of people would be saying, the bloke's not up to it. Why is he not seizing on this? It's evidence that his team is not particularly well organised and not maximising their opportunities to attack. And I think that's becoming a legitimate criticism of Keir Starmer as well.